Hello everybody, I think we'll get started and other people will join as we're going. Welcome to this COZ. I think we're up to about number 56 by now. This is going to be about the music of Terezin and music and memory. And it's going to feature Rachel Adelstein and Carol Uslin. I'll introduce Rachel and then Rachel can take it from there as far as what's going to happen. Rachel's an ethnomusicologist. She's based in New Haven, Connecticut. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, where her thesis dissertation was entitled Braided Voices, Women Cantors in Non-Orthodox Judaism. And then between 2014 and 2017, she was at Corpus Christi at Cambridge, where she conducted fieldwork for a project exploring the musical lives of British synagogues. She's produced a series of podcasts on music and Jewish life around the world, and she's presented her research internationally to academic and public audiences and published a deal of it in a wide range of publications. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. And I'm really glad to be back at COZ interviewing yet another one of my good friends. So my friend Karen Uslin, we must have met. Karen, have we ever actually met in person, or have we just sort of been communicating through, video chat all this time? Because
I think it's been video chat. I don't know if we've ever gotten to be in person.
That you can form a friendship with someone like this. So Karen is a researcher of music and the Holocaust. You got your PhD a couple of years ago from American University, is that correct?
Catholic. Yes, I went to the Catholic University of America and I specialized in Jewish music and music from the Holocaust.
And then you got a couple of interesting teaching positions at Rowan and at Stockton.
Yes.
And you're still sort of technically at Stockton, but you have a fabulous new job, which is what I want to talk to you about a little bit. You are the Director of Research for the Defiant Requiem Foundation in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
It's a wonderful job for someone like you to have. And just as a way of segueing from the introduction into our conversation, can you introduce us to the Defiant Requiem Foundation? Sort of who are they? What do they do? What do you do there all day when you're not causing with us?
What do I do when I'm not on with all of you wonderful people? So I will, I can show the website later and I'll put a link to the website in the chat for those of you who are interested to take a look. But basically at the Defiant Requiem Foundation, we focus on education and performance of music that was composed in the Terezin concentration camp. And those are the two big boxes. We do a lot of variety within those boxes. We also do a lot of Zoom events. We've had a lot of great Zoom lectures and events. My colleague David Flake, who's on here, just did a great event for us on Gideon Klein a couple weeks ago. So those are the two, main aspects: performance and education, and all that can entail. My job as Director of Research kind of crosses over both of those. So I, as Director of Research right now, I'm working on a book with Murray Sidlin, who's our artistic director, where we're looking into some of the instrumental music that's been composed in Terezin and the composers and their lives, and how their lives led up to them composing the music they did in Terezin. So that's part of what I'm doing. And the other part is actually on the education end. We have a program called a University Residency Project, where we give grant money to colleges and universities to put on a week-long series of events that ends with a performance of one of the concert dramas that we offer, whether it's Hours of Freedom, which focuses on the instrumental music and the new music studio in Terezin, and then Defiant Requiem, which some of you who are on here may be familiar with, and that is the story of the Verdi Requiem performances in Terezin. So I'm in the middle of sending out massive amounts of emails and mailings about our university residency project right now. And then on the side, I also, with a lot of the composers we've been doing on the side, I'm actually also a professional genealogist. So I'm looking sort of into that road with a lot of our composers and Terezin people as well.
That sounds amazing. And we may end up talking a little bit more about that later if there's time. But what I'd like to ask you a little bit is about the performances. You mentioned these two performance events.
The concert dramas.
and the concert dramas, and these sort of seem to be the bread and butter of
Yes.
the Defiant Requiem Foundation. You've told us what the Defiant Requiem is, but can you describe for us the concert dramas a bit?
Sure. And I mean, the foundation emerged out of the Defiant Requiem performances. So, you know, that you are right on the bread and butter analogy. And actually in April, it will be 20 years since the first performance of Defiant Requiem. So
what is it?
Thank you. So Defiant Requiem is I call it a multimedia concert drama. So we have a chorus and orchestra and 4 soloists who will sing through the entire Verdi Requiem. And that Verdi Requiem performance is interspersed with some dialogue and some video of interviews with some of our survivors who were in the Verdi Requiem chorus. We have a narrator who will give some quotes from different sources about the Verdi Requiem performances. So it's basically a multimedia concert drama that tells the story of Raphael Schechter and the choir that sang the Verdi Requiem in Terezin.
How long does it last?
It's a little over 2 hours. And in addition to the full orchestra version, we also now do a piano violin version, which while these are not performances that are trying to recreate what happened in Terezin, they memorialize and they tell the story in a multimedia concert education way, but it's not a recreation. However, we do have a version that is, like I said, piano and violin, which I do know historically is a little more accurate as to what happened in Terezin, because obviously they did not have a full orchestra playing the Verdi Requiem in Terezin. But that is how the Defiant Requiem performances work. So if you see clips online, and there are some clips on YouTube from various performances, it is, concert blacks for the choir and the orchestra. It looks like a typical concert performance, and you'll see a film screen behind the choir that then after each movement shows some video and testimony, etc. And then we also have a concert drama that's a little newer called Hours of Freedom. And it takes a little bit of the same structure. There's a film screen, there's some video, there's some interviews, there's a narrator who talks a little bit about the composers, but this is actually more of a chamber orchestra work. So it's 18 musicians and I believe a narrator and 4 singers. And this is more on solo songs and instrumental music that was composed in Terezin. So this is a little more of the chamber music version of music in Terezin.
And it seems a little bit more portable than the whole
Verdi show. Much more portable. The full Defiant Requiem is a bit of a beast, as you can imagine. Performing the Verdi Requiem in normal circumstances is a bit of a beast. And I have performed Defiant Requiem in the choir twice, one in Terezin and once at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. For those of you who have been to Terezin before, we were in the Riding Academy when we performed, and I happened to be standing right next to the big timpani drum. So you can imagine the DACRA was a lot of fun with that one. I think I still feel that one in my bones a little bit with that drum.
So here's an interesting question, and some of these are questions that we've talked about earlier, and some of these are just things that pop into my head. So this one may be a bit of a surprise to you. No, tell me, so the one thing that's really interesting about the Defiant Requiem in particular, and this I'm focusing a bit on this because this is what the foundation is named after. And they're using Verdi's Requiem as a way to spread Holocaust memory and Holocaust education at this point. We'll talk later on about the differences and similarities between the two. The Verdi Requiem is an extremely Catholic piece of music. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how the Defiant Requiem Foundation decided to seize on this particular performance of a Catholic piece of music by Jewish prisoners as the best way to memorialize the Holocaust.
On some level, I feel like this is a little bit of just kind of the universe and the stars aligned, and it just sort of snowballed. For those of you who don't know the story of how our artistic director, Murray Sidling, kind of found out about all of this, he had been a professor of conducting at one of the universities in Minnesota, happened to walk by a used bookstore that had the Yoja Karish Music and Terezin book, randomly picked it up and happened to see that there was a chapter on the Verdi Requiem, and he sort of took a look and was a little surprised and very intrigued and kind of wondered what this was all about. And that's a very Cliff Notes version of how he started on his journey and how this ended up being, this is what we focus on. I think, if you want to dig a little deeper into that, I think any conductor, when they see Verdi Requiem, that's going to be something that just grabs their attention. So I think there was a little bit of that as well. I mean, he could have randomly opened up to any page in that book with, any of the opera or vocal or instrumental pieces that are talked about in that particular piece of work. So, I think that was a little bit random on that sense. I mean, it wasn't a piece that was picked, because of its Catholic origins or because it was, something that Murray was looking for. It just so happened that's what he happened to stumble upon and went from there. I think for me personally, over the years, and I have done some presentations and conferences on this idea of this Catholic work that was sung by Jewish prisoners in a concentration camp. I was raised Roman Catholic and then ended up doing all of this Jewish music stuff. So just on a personal level, that's a really interesting idea to look into. And it's an idea I teach my students a lot as well. When I go, this is very much sort of a piece that was written in memory of an Italian nationalist. I mean, Verdi didn't necessarily pick this because he was, because it was Catholic. Sort of the Catholic part of it was secondary to what this piece of music could be. And so I think that's an interesting idea too. But when you look at the text of the Requiem, this idea of everything from, peace to day of wrath to, I think the ideas are universal. It may have started out as a Catholic mass for the dead, but I think there are universal ideas throughout the piece. And I think that those ideas can be grabbed onto by anyone, and that, it really can kind of personalize it for you. It's going to mean something to you based on your life experience at the time.
I mean, certainly for non-Jewish audiences, I think it's a very interesting way to introduce them to the concept of, and I hate to put it this way, but this was really, ultimately one of the themes of the Holocaust, reminding them that Jews are people too.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how the Defiant Requiem Foundation does frame this story, since they do have this Verdi Requiem that is at the same time sort of universal and also at the same time kind of Catholic, that the Jewish prisoners did seize on, that this was something that they thought was to perform. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how the story, not of the Requiem itself, but the story of the programming, the story that the programming is trying to tell, that, that this is, that there's something that in this Requiem that will connect a largely American audience or a largely non-Jewish audience to humanizing the memory of the 6 million. And that's a large number.
Right. And I think actually what you just said is sort of the, on some level, it's sort of the crux of it. I think a lot of times when we look at, or when we hear data about the Holocaust and we hear these big numbers, we hear 6 million, we hear 11 million, if you count also non-Jewish victims of the Holocaust. We hear, the numbers of all, I think it's something like 52 million is the number between soldiers, civilians, Holocaust victims, et cetera, within the entire scope of World War II. And I think when you hear these big numbers, it's hard to conceptualize the human beings behind these big numbers. And I think that's where the Defiant Requiem comes in. It's not a foundation or an organization, and the performance itself is not supposed to be this, catch-all, but it's focusing on one story that can be told that brings the human aspect into this, that gives faces and gives names and gives specific places and incidents in time that people can then come away with and say that they had a meaningful experience learning and educating themselves about what the Holocaust, an aspect of the Holocaust that they didn't know about, or that, you know, they can now, when they see that number 6 million, they can think of names and faces and people that makes that 6 million seem, I don't want to say seem a little smaller, but maybe seem more human than just a number. And I think even in a lot of the work that I've done over the years, that's, and not to say the music is not important, but for me, the music was always a gateway to learning about who these people are as human beings, because I knew that what made them the human beings they were is how you had to understand, you know, to understand them as human beings was to understand their music. And I tell this to my students all the time, this idea that the notes on the page is the end result of a human story. And you have to understand that human story to understand those notes on the page. And so I think that's maybe the ultimate goal of Defiant Requiem, is this idea of bringing a story and making it human so that people who see this can walk away and go, maybe I can conceptualize and understand the Holocaust a little bit better.
And that's actually a wonderful way to segue into some of the broader questions that I wanted to discuss with you. And that is, and I think the first thing that we might want to talk about a little bit is the role of music in Holocaust education. Now, you're doing a particularly public-facing form of education. That is, you're not teaching in a high school classroom. You've taught aspects of this in a college classroom, but in your capacity as director of research, you're working for an organization that is essentially using public musicology to educate. And so I guess the first question is, do you have a sense of whether you have mostly Jewish or non-Jewish audiences? Like, who are you educating here?
I would say it's probably 50-50 at this point. Now, we actually do have a middle school and high school curriculum. We have a wonderful director of education, Alexandra Zapruder, who focuses on that aspect of things. And we also have done teacher workshops and seminars the last few summers that take middle school and high school educators, and we do a week-long series of workshops with them. We're actually in the process of revamping a little bit, specifically our music and culture curriculum within that. But there are lesson plans and there are educational materials on our websites for those in those grade levels. And I would say because of that, because we have this aspect of education that reaches both parochial and public schools, and you know, in my job as director of research, you know, we're focusing on reaching both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. And I would say that's maybe a 50-50 split at this point. And I know for me personally, that's an aspect that I tried as well to do over the years. Obviously, you know, I mentioned that I was not raised Jewish, although I'm from Philadelphia and I was raised in Northeast Philadelphia, which had a predominantly Catholic and Jewish population. You know, I grew up 10 minutes away from the Jewish Y and the Holocaust Education Center that's in Philly. My dance recitals were at the Jewish Y when I was like 4, 5, 6 years old. And, you know, I grew up with all of my Catholic neighbors going to the kosher butcher shops to get meat after church on Sundays. So this was very much my life, you know, access to both of these sides. And so for me, it's important to not discriminate on who learns the stories.
Although, and we might continue this vein a little bit later on. Sometimes you do have to tell the stories a little bit differently, depending on who your audience is. But at the moment, what I kind of like to ask you about is, since you do have this large curriculum and you're focused on education, what role do you see music playing in Holocaust education?
I think it's incredibly important. And on one hand, I know that that might be a little bit of the pot calling the kettle black, since, I am a musicologist by trade. And so, of course, I would gravitate towards music. But I think music is one of those things that is a great way to get people invested in learning about stories. And I think culture is so much a representation of people and time and place. And, I think a lot of times, 400 or 500 years down the road, it's going to be our music now and our poetry and our literature and our theater that people are going to look at to see, what was the mindset, or what were people thinking about different things at this time. And so I think that's why it's important. Culture gives a great framework to understanding a people and a time, and music is very much a part of that cultural milieu. So I think it's important, because also I think it's important to understand that even in situations that you might not think culture on that level could thrive, that there are people writing music, there are people making plays, there are people writing poetry. And I think the world needs to see that even in these horrific circumstances, you have people keeping a culture alive. And that's an important thing to know.
Yeah, there's a quote from Bertolt Brecht that sort of goes around every now and then. Will there still be singing in the dark times? The answer is yes. There will be singing about the dark times.
Yes.
And when I was writing my master's thesis about music and Holocaust memory, one of the things that I found very interesting about music, I was in some parts of the thesis, I was essentially comparing the difference between the performing arts and visual art when it came to memorializing the Holocaust. And one thing that was fascinating to me was the idea that you can walk away from a piece of art, you can kind of let your eyes slide over it and walk on to the next thing in the gallery. But music is, as so many people have said, the art of decorating time. And that if you're going to listen to a piece of music, you have to sit with it. And you have to invest some time, and you can, to a certain extent, you can let your mind wander, but there's the sound. Your ears don't shut off ever.
Right.
And that one thing that I've always found rather effective about music in these sorts of situations, and I think that memory and education are two different situations. We can talk more about that. But one thing that I've always found rather interesting is the idea that you have to invest the time in music. And that because you're sitting and listening, you become part of the event in the way that you might not if you are looking at a painting, for instance.
Right. And I absolutely agree with that. I mean, and I think this is why I was not someone who could ever study to music. I know some people like having music in the background when they're studying, or they're doing something that needs focus. And I'm like, I can't, if I have to focus on something else, I can't have music on, because automatically I'm going to focus on the music instead of what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think that's the beauty of it. I think it's the kind of thing where it sweeps over you and it makes you part of it. And I also think it can, and I know that there is some visual art that does that too, but I think with music, it personalizes a narrative for you, in the sense that that piece of music is going to mean something different to you than it means to the person next to you, based on whatever your life experience has been up to that point, whatever's going on in your life at that point. That music is going to be a personal experience to you in that moment and that moment in time. And I think that's what makes it so amazing, is that it can go into people's hearts and minds in completely different ways and still have the same importance and meaning.
And as to return to what we were saying about personalizing the story, hearing music can in some ways at least help you form, I think they'd call it a parasocial connection with
Yeah.
the original composers and performers. The idea that you're hearing a piece of music that was composed and performed by real people, or even if you're learning to sing a piece yourself, you're taking the words of this
Yeah.
person who was murdered for being Jewish, and you're almost literally giving that person breath again for the
Right.
span of a performance.
And I think that's one of the other, if I could say, and I did put the website for the Defiant Requiem Foundation in the chat for anybody who's interested. So I'm not going to verbatim repeat the mission statement and all of that. If you're interested, please go to the website. Go to the website anyway. There's a lot of great stuff on there. But I think if there's an ethos that I could say I've approached my work with Defiant Requiem with, it's that this idea of there was such a community of artists and musicians, and their lives and their careers were cut short in the most horrific and brutal way. And if I have the ability to bring these people to life for an audience and for the public, that their names can be known, their music can be known, that we can give them a little bit of what was so cruelly taken from them. And I'm not saying that that means that everybody should love the music. I know there's, we might get into this a little bit, this debate of should this music be in the canon? How do you analyze this music, etc. But I think it's important that the music is out there for people to talk about, that these should be names and pieces that are in the mix of the conversation. And there are some, there's such beautiful music from these composers, both in Terezin and before they were deported to Terezin. There's beautiful, beautiful music out there, and it deserves to have its day in the sun. And these composers deserve to have the chance to have their music and their work live on. And so if I can be a part of that, then, that's the best thing I could think of to do with my life. And I discover new things every day on this front. I'm going to throw a music example in. So we can get a music example in. I'm going to throw a music example in. So this was a piece, and I actually only discovered this piece once I had started working a little bit with our Hours of Freedom concert drama. I don't know how many of you are familiar with James Simone, who was a Berlin-born cello player and musician and composer. He actually did some concerts with Alma Rose in the Netherlands before he was deported to Terezin. And this is a piece that he wrote just not too long before he was deported. But it's a cello ariosa, and it's one of my favorite pieces of music ever right now. And so I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to make sure that I share my sound because we wouldn't want that to happen. Okay, and so I'm going to now, hold on a second. This many down, there we go. All right, I'm just going to play a couple minutes of this because this is what I mean about music washing over you.
You can certainly play quite a bit of it. We have time.
Okay.
In fact, let's hear it, the whole thing.
Okay.
That is an absolutely beautiful piece of music.
Isn't that, I am obsessed with that piece. I listen to that at least like once a day now ever since I heard it. And that's the kind of thing that just, I
And
mean,
it's lovely. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? What its connection is?
right. So James Simone wrote this piece. This was, like I said, we actually don't have any, at least none that has been found, any manuscripts of pieces he wrote physically in Terezin. But this was written in his career prior to him going to Terezin. We do know, we have documentation of people mentioning that he did write pieces in Terezin, but those manuscripts have not survived. So this is,
Who was he? For people who maybe don't know the
right.
name James Simone, who was he?
So James Simone was born in Berlin, and he was a professional, he was a musician, he was a composer. He studied in Berlin. He got a PhD in musicology, and he also did a lot of touring. He did go to Israel in the 20s. And he did some performances there, but came back to Europe. And then he ended up doing some concerts with Alma Rose, who was the famous Auschwitz Women's Orchestra leader. And it was right, he actually was deported from the Netherlands to Terezin. So this was somebody who was a professional musician. He toured, he taught, he did concerts. He was a known name in the world at that time, and then was sent to Terezin and unfortunately did not survive. And he, wrote beautiful instrumental music. He also wrote a massive amount of lieder. And fun little story, 6 of those lieder pieces are actually in the Marian Anderson collection at the University of Pennsylvania, because James Simone's piano accompanist ended up becoming the accompanist for Marian Anderson. And he had some of these James Simone manuscripts, and 6 of them ended up randomly in the Marian Anderson collection at the University of Pennsylvania, which I never in a million years would have thought to look there for music from a composer, from a Holocaust era composer, but you find things in sometimes the most random of places, and these were 6 songs we had no idea about prior.
Interesting. And so hearing this story, the story of sort of the chancy nature of the survival of music, that just as it was almost a matter of chance if a person survived or not, that it 3 days might have made the difference between life and death, or deciding to walk on one side of the street versus the other, that kind of chance, that it also works out for music that way. And so that I think one of the great things that musicologists, both academic and public musicologists, can do is to provide a framework to reintroduce music. So one thing that I'd like to ask you about at the moment, the Defiant Requiem Foundation does serve this function of sort of being an institutional home for composers like James Simone, who we might not know very much about, or Victor Allman, or Pavel Haas, or Gideon Klein, names that we might be a bit more familiar with. What do you see as the advantage of having an organization like the Defiant Requiem Foundation to sort of frame these pieces? What is the advantage to them as pieces of music?
I think, and I can only say from my experiences as a researcher. So I started working on music in Terezin randomly as an undergraduate in 2003 at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which is where I got my degrees in music and theater. And for my senior thesis project, the movie The Pianist had just come out. I had a bit of a family history with World War II. I had a lot of great uncles who fought in the war. My grandmother's oldest brother was killed on Iwo Jima. And so I sort of grew up with this World War II family history. And I was a pianist and I loved Chopin. And so it just seemed the stars all aligned to make a project on Jewish composers in Nazi Europe. And randomly, Bob Follett, who was the music librarian for Peabody at the time. His wife, Diane, was my advisor at Muhlenberg, and he mentioned to Diane, hey, Karen may want to look at this guy named Victor Allman, and, here's the result of that random chance thing. But when I was first starting out, this was very much a needle in a haystack research. I mean, first off, the internet in 2003 was not as necessarily robust as it is now. So websites were slightly primitive. I was looking for a sentence here. The Karish book, randomly, my college library had, so I was able to look there. That was basically it. There was no place to really go, or no place that I knew of to look for this thing that was music and Terezin and the Holocaust. So I think just in general, the idea of having a place that is known for this, that people know that they can go in the future, or they know that they can reach out to people to get information, to do research, because for as much as we know, there's still a massive amount that we're learning every day that we don't necessarily know. And so to have a place, and I would say that this is true even for organizations that focus on music from other camps, or Jewish music in general, Jewish music institutes in general, having those places that of exist, that you can go to, that you can get information, that you can contact people, that you can look into things. My hope would be that the work that I can do will make a life for those future researchers a little bit easier. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is the benefit of having a place like Defiant Requiem Foundation. Yes, it's very specific in what it does, but it means that for the future, there's a place where people who want to know about the history of the composers who are performing this music, or the larger context of Terezin, there's a place to go, and that information may be a little easier to find than it was when I was starting out.
And it seems like the public concerts and the events that you do are a great way of drawing attention to the research work that gets done behind the scenes, and the sort of secondary function as a repository, as an archive.
Right.
So I noticed this was very interesting, that as we were watching the score go by in the video, it's a handwritten score.
Yeah.
Do you know if it's ever been published?
I do think this one has been published. Now, some of the music that we have done, some of it has been published, and some of it is still manuscript form that has not been published. What I can tell you is that I know Boozy and Hawks has published a fair amount of pieces from composers from Terezin. Actually, when I was working on my master's thesis, which was on Allman's Der Kaiser von Atlantis, which was the opera he wrote in Terezin, and I remember all of the scores that I got of Victor Allman's music from Terezin were from Boozy and Hawks. And and yes, Brett Werb just mentioned this in the chat. I do see people writing in the chat. I promise I will get to everybody.
We'll get to all of your questions.
We'll get there. But Brett Werb did mention, and I do have to say, when I was writing my dissertation, that the Holocaust Museum in DC also does have some of these music manuscripts as well. And I did take a look at a lot of them when I was down here as a graduate student. And once things with the pandemic calms down and I can actually get back to going places in person, I hope to look into a lot more of these.
Yeah. So, and it seems to me that one role that the Defiant Requiem Foundation might play would be to publish some of the unpublished music. And that kind of brings me to another topic that maybe we should discuss a little bit. Because, Boozy and Hawks is a major music publisher.
Right.
And if Boozy and Hawks is publishing Victor Allman, essentially what they're saying is that, Victor Allman is now part of the canon, that one can evaluate Victor Allman's music in the same way that one might evaluate the music of, Brahms, or the music of Poulenc, or, somebody else.
Right.
And we've talked a little bit about this before, and I'd love to talk with you a little bit more about it, about whether or not one should be able to evaluate the music of the Terezin composers separately from their political context. And, if that is even possible, because, there is this Holocaust cage around some of these things. And it seems to me that it is almost impossible to do that there are some people that don't ever escape that cage. And I think what I'd like to discuss with you now is whether it is a good idea to evaluate composers completely free of their political contexts.
Right. And I think on some level, especially when we talk, and not just the Terezin composers, but any musicians or composers who ended up in the camps and ended up writing music in the camps, I think sometimes we forget that a lot of these people, either they were just starting out or they did have fairly established careers prior to getting deported. So for example, with Victor Allman, we do have music he wrote 15, 20 years before, the word Terezin was ever part of his environment. So we can look at music he wrote prior to his deportation and music he wrote while he was in Terezin. But I think if we're going to look at the entire oeuvre that we have available of somebody, I don't think, and I would say this is true not only for Terezin composers, but I think this is just true of studying composers and music history in general. I don't think if the music is the result of the human being, you can't remove the human being from their context. Mm-hmm. To understand the human being, you have to understand everything that surrounded that human being. And that does mean that those things will change as that person's life continues. But you have to understand the full human being to understand the music. And I would maybe make the argument a little bit that the music that composers wrote in Terezin are not only a product of their circumstances at the time, but a product of everything that was happening in their lives going into there, that these were people who were reflecting back on things they lost. These were people who in many cases had gone through the university educated music process and were products of that sort of higher classical music echelon that they were surrounded by, and that everything they learned was going to be put into the music that they composed in Terezin as well. And that it was going to be also a product of the people they met in Terezin, that, people they were meeting with maybe different backgrounds or different musical experiences than they had, that all of those things they were learning there comes into the music. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's right to divorce the context from the pieces. Now, do I think that means that that is a barrier to analyzing those pieces in the grand scheme of things? No, I don't, because I feel like we analyze all composers. We should be analyzing all composers within their context. And I guess the thing I think of somebody like Beethoven. How often do people separate Beethoven's deafness from analyzing the pieces he wrote when he had completely lost his hearing, or is that part of the mix of the conversation? And I think I'm
also thinking a little bit about Alex Ross's latest Doorstopper tome.
Beautiful.
Wagnerism, about restoring Wagner, not only Wagner and Wagner's music and public response to Wagner,
right?
And Wagner's most infamous fan. Mm-hmm. That one you get a 600-page book if you do that.
Right.
It's one of the most comprehensive looks, not just at a body of work, but at the composer who published it and at the circumstances that made this possible. So I'm wondering what sort of things might a Defiant Requiem Foundation approach to framing composers? What might that teach musicologists who are not working on composers with such an obvious political framing? But what might that teach musicologists about maybe how the discipline could move forward?
Right. Well, I think on some level, I think on some level, sometimes, for whatever area of specialties people have, people get tunnel vision, and it's hard for them to break out of that tunnel vision. And actually, I was going to dovetail off a little bit of what you were saying, before. One of the things that I've done and that I'm working on and that will be included in the book, at least, the sources, the bibliography, is where I'm looking for information on people is more than just music history textbooks or archives or that kind of thing. One of the things that I did that was that's been really fascinating is using the genealogy websites that I use when I'm researching people's family histories and plugging our Terezin composers into those genealogy websites to see what comes up. And one of the sites, newspapers.com, I literally just did this at the end of last week. I took every composer that we use in Hours of Freedom and plugged their names between 1900 and 1945 into newspapers.com. And you would be amazed at how many newspapers in the United States mention these names. So Hans Krasse had pieces in the 20s performed with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Rudolf Carell's name appears in Czech language newspapers in Wilson, Kansas in 1914 and 1919.
Wilson, Kansas.
Pavel Haas had a piece performed in 1945 in the US, and he's listed by name with the string quartet that was being performed. And so these were names. A really interesting one who, not necessarily a composer, but a well-known Terezin figure, Dr. Kurt Zinger, who was a neurologist and a musicologist, have fun with that one, wrote this amazing book on music and vocal care from 1936. Mm-hmm. That book was reviewed in almost every newspaper in the United States at the time. I have a stack of newspaper printouts that mention his name and doctors analyzing his information. Wow. Fascinatingly enough, I was able to get an English language translation of this book. Thank you, Amazon used books randomly. And he even talks about things about how like inappropriate teacher relationships with students can affect students' ability to perform in the future, which sort of with the lexicon today with things like Me Too movement and all of that, I feel like that's a fascinating thing to look at, that in 1936, people were analyzing these things that we are still talking about today. And so I think
we have this wonderful, rich social and political context.
Yes.
And so we're not seeing the Terezin composers. We're essentially freeing them from this historical prison that we would put them in. While we do that, we're still acknowledging that this is where they ended up. And this is, in some sense, why they've become famous. Why, out of all of the composers that were working at the time, why do we remember Victor Allman, and why not, Victor Ullmann's study partner at his university, or why do we remember Pavel Haas and not the guy who was on the program after him, because of what happened to them.
And I think
fascinating dichotomy in the way that we that we need to approach analyzing the music.
And I think that's why I sort of decided to go, kind of approach this the way that I did, because I think for me, I approached it as I want to find out what makes the whole human. Yes, I know how their story ends, but I need to understand the human from their beginnings and through their life up to that ending. And so looking in sort of, and maybe non-traditional is not the right word to use, but I think looking in places that you wouldn't necessarily think to look, just to find out whose names are out there and what people were saying and where their music was being performed and what kind of where things that Kurt Zinger actually had obituaries run in 1945 in the United States, where word had gotten out that he had died a couple years previously, but word was getting out about what happened to him. And that was publicized nationally. And you just think there's more to these people than the little bullet points that most people would rattle off. And so I think,
and it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting corrective to a lot of Holocaust education that's out there. And in fact, and this will segue into the last major topic that I wanted to discuss with you, sort of the ways that Holocaust education in some sense stands in for broader education about anti-Semitism, broader education about the Jewish people. One flaw, I would say, that I have noticed in a lot of, I would say, memorializing and educating about Jewish life in Europe before the war is that the first focus tends to be on the death of the Jewish community in Europe. That when in 2008, I spent a summer in Lithuania at the Yiddish program there. And we had 2 city tours as part of the language program. And the first city tour was the tour of all the Holocaust sites. So the tour of the ghetto, and we went out to Ponar, and we went out to Kovno and looked at the Ninth Fort. So the first tour we got was of how the Jews of Vilna died. And then the second tour that we had about a week later was we were taken around to the homes of all of the Yiddish writers and poets and artists and the original home of Yivo in Vilna. And that was the tour of how the Jews had lived. And I thought that that was a bit backwards. I thought that the program, and this is something that I've seen a lot in, particularly I think in Jewish education, is putting much more emphasis on how the Jews died rather than how they lived. And I think that one thing that that your work and the work that the Defiant Requiem Foundation does very well is to return the focus to the ways that the Jews lived and what they did and the art that they produced and who they were as people. So I think that's really fabulous. But I'd kind of like, and we have about maybe, 10 or 15 minutes left. What I'd like to do now is sort of open up to a few broader questions about sort of the role that this kind of education in music, in art, in the role that the Holocaust played. How would this factor into larger education about anti-Semitism? I mean, particularly given that telling people that the Holocaust happened does not seem to have stopped the tide of anti-Semitism. Recent graffiti on Auschwitz is any indicator.
And I think actually this does connect a little bit to what you just said about this idea of, looking at how Jewish communities and Jewish composers and musicians lived versus focusing on how they died, acknowledging how they died, but not making that the center of the narrative. Because I think one thing that I have found, especially teaching my students at Stockton, one of the courses I do is called a heritage course, and it's a 101 Jewish history course. It covers from biblical to modern day. So we only get, a week or so with each time period. But one of the things that I will do is I will look at things like anti-Semitism in the Renaissance in Venice, look at the ghettos from long before, a World War II was ever a thought in anybody's mind. I think people forget that the Jewish community has, especially if we're looking maybe specifically in European circumstances, as far as history of classical Western music goes, that kind of thing. I think people forget, this is a community that existed long before there was ever such a thing that we call the middle of the 20th century, the Holocaust, and that anti-Semitism was always in that mix. I think in looking, if we're going to put the emphasis on how these communities have lived, we have to look at what did anti-Semitism look like in those prior eras. And I think that gets a little lost. I think my students sometimes get amazed when things like yellow stars or ghettos are not terms that suddenly popped up in 1939 or 1940. And
The original Ghetto was a
right,
17th century thing, as I recall.
exactly. And so I think that this is important, I do this sometimes, and I'll say, okay, we know these sort of things from the Holocaust, but you have to look back and see these were things that were in existence long prior to the Holocaust as well. And so I think that that's important too, that, the Holocaust becomes kind of the main example people use of anti-Semitism, but I think doing a comparative might not be the right word, but sort of a study of this is not something that was new, that just came up out, randomly in the middle of the 20th century. There was a long history of this coming into it. And how did that, affect the musicians? If we're going to look at somebody like Salman Rushdie, how did anti-Semitism in his time affect what he was able to do? If we're going to look at, anti-Semitism in the age of enlightenment or things like that, there were always things going on. And so I think in that, drive to create a full picture, this is one piece and you have to connect it to all the other pieces to make that full picture.
Yeah, and that really does tie in with some of the themes that you've been talking about earlier about forming personal connections, about knowing who people were before this very significant moment in their lives, and sort of opening up the idea of educating about the Holocaust, about music, about the Jewish people, about the Jewish people's relationship to the rest of the world, and sort of realizing that it's all interconnected, that it's not just one thing or the other. And I think one last thing, and I did, this is the thing that I told you that I was going to spring on you after we set out the parameters of this, but it's a fascinating thing to think about. And I've been thinking about it a bit. And that is this whole idea of the Holocaust memorial. That is that in some way, the Defiant Requiem Foundation is part of a whole culture of public memorials to the Holocaust. So we have, the Defiant Requiem Foundation, we have the United States Holocaust Museum, we have the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, the one with the stones, which I think it's terribly designed, and I think is a bad Holocaust memorial. We have museums set up at the Ninth Fort, and that we have all sorts of public art, of stones, of cenotaphs, of names on walls. There's one in New Haven, of all places. It's on Bailey Avenue, the middle of, it's the middle of a throughway through the city across the street from a cemetery. And what's interesting about these is that so many of these memorials are put up by countries that were not the direct perpetrators of the Holocaust. I mean, indirectly, there was a guy who wrote a 436-page book that took way too long to explain this, but indirectly contributing, but not the direct perpetrators. And there's been a lot of conversation in the United States over the past year and a half about the role of public monumental art. In the example mostly used is Confederate statues, but the role of public monumental art and what it does for people, what it's memorializing, why it's there. It's not for education, we've been told, but what is it for? So I guess what I'd like you to maybe spend a few minutes spinning on is what you see the role of something like a performance by the Defiant Requiem Foundation, how you see that as a public memorial. Who is it for? And what do we want people to get from it in the realm of public memory, which I think is different than education.
Right. And I agree with that. I think public memory and education, while I think they can overlap, I think there are some distinct areas here. I also think when you're talking about the United States and our history of immigration and the history of sort of people over here who had been over here for a while but still had family in Europe that then were caught up in the Holocaust, I think it's maybe not surprising that we have so many of these public memorials and things over here, because I think there are a fair bit of families that can kind of claim family history on that front. I think in the case of something like the Defiant Requiem, I think it's a little, public memorial in one sense, yes, but a little bit different than sort of a stone monolith that has names or dates or places on it. And I think on some level, to me, sort of those stone memorials that are those stereotypical, like you mentioned in New Haven, I think that's another one where kind of you can see numbers or you can see names or you can see places, but it maybe is hard to humanize something from just looking at a plaque on a piece of stone, where something like Defiant Requiem is living and it's breathing and it's, gives you that musical component that you don't get from stone. It gives you names and faces and a specific thing to kind of hold on to, which is a little bit different than a stone memorial. And I think and I think the other thing that is different is that once stone is carved and once those sort of physical memorials are set, they're set in stone for however long that stone lasts. Where I think with Defiant Requiem, it's a little different in that it lives and breathes, but it changes. So as we learn new information, as we get and we're getting new information, I get new information every single day. I look and find something I didn't know before, or, I find a memoir, or I find things that I didn't know were out there before. And as we learn things, we incorporate things and we broaden our horizons to bring that to the public, to put more out there. So I think that's also the difference, is that stone will not change, but something like what Defiant Requiem does, we have the ability to constantly be learning more, to constantly finding out new things, and then constantly being able to adjust might not be the quite word, but add to and bring more to the public. And if we find, there have been some things that I've researched, for some of our composers with Hours of Freedom that, has meant that we've adjusted our script for Hours of Freedom a little bit because, some information that we thought this one thing was true, and we just found documentation that actually, it's something else, whether it's a year or a place or something that was not quite what we thought. So we adjust and we change to make sure that we're bringing as correct information and as up-to-date information as we know to the public. And I think that's the beauty of it, that it's a constant learning experience, not only for us, but then as we learn, we get to update the public.
Karen, thank you so much for this conversation. This was absolutely
Thank
wonderful.
you.
And there are a bunch of people that the chat has been quite active.
Yes, it has been
I think
active.
that this might be the moment to open up our little mutual admiration society and welcome everybody to start asking some of these amazing questions that are in the chat. And we've got a whole bunch of hands. So how do we want to do this? Do we can Phil Alexander, if you could go through the chat and sort of pull some of the questions from there. And I see that Agnes Corey has her hand up. So maybe while Agnes asks her questions, Phil, if you could go and start collating some questions from the chat, that would be great. So Agnes, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
I hope I'm unmuted. Am I unmuted?
You are
yes,
now.
you are.
Okay. Well, thank you for this event. I've got one question and one comment. Am I allowed both? I'll be very economical with my words.
We have plenty of time. Go
Okay.
ahead.
So the question is that, Karen, I might have missed this, so I apologize if I did. But do you know why James Simone wrote this solo cello piece? I mean, he was not a cellist. And in fact, you very kindly showed the manuscript, and the very last chords, they are not playable on the cello. So it's quite clear he was not a cellist. we know he was a pianist, but it seems to me he definitely didn't play the cello. So do you have any idea what prompted him to compose this very beautiful and extensive solo cello piece? So that's the question. The comment is trickier, and I hope I'm not going to upset anybody or insult anybody. I'm a little bit worried about this Verdi Requiem concerts. I went to one of the performances in Budapest. It was in a huge sports stadium, about which I personally wasn't very happy. So, I mean, the Verdi Requiem meant something very, very different, as you all know, for the people in Terezin. And I mean, Simon Broughton's documentary film shows that beautifully. And when I went to this stadium thing, there were quite a few Holocaust survivors who went there in memory of those who didn't survive. There were also a lot of people who went for totally different reasons, and it was a little bit of a circus. So what I'm saying is that kind of you ought to be careful. There's a very thin line between memory and Holocaust industry. And so this is the comment, and this is not a criticism about you, but this is something which worried me when I was sitting in that sports stadium. This was totally not appropriate, in my opinion.
So, well, I'm going to take the Simon question first. As to why he wrote this piece, that I am unsure of. I'm still looking a little bit into that. What I do know was just that he was an active musical performer and composer, and whether he just wrote this because that was the inspiration he got, whether he was writing this for a specific person, that I am unsure of. I can say though, he does have a great niece who did end up as a professional cellist. She was born after the war, but she was a professor at Boston College for cello for a little while, which I found just kind of interesting, given everything. As far as the performances in Budapest, what I can say now, I was not a singer in one of those performances, but I do have a little bit of information on how those performances came about. And I do know that it's, we don't necessarily get to pick the venue when we're asked to perform someplace. So what I can tell you is that 3 times Murray has been asked to bring Defiant Requiem to Budapest, but that the venue is not ours to pick. So the people who decided that they wanted this over there were the ones who chose the venue. But I do agree that, I have seen clips of some of those Budapest performances, and I do agree that there are some big cavernous spaces. And sometimes that can work and sometimes that does not. But that's sort of the background that I know of a little bit for how that came about.
Well, lesson to be learned for future, so that the murdered people are honored and not exploited. Okay, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I see a hand from David Fligg. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you, and it's great to hear
see you
as well. And Rachel, I have to say that you are a formidably wonderful interviewer.
Thank you.
You're both blushing. This is a comment more than a question, but it is about memorialization, and we have to be mindful about this, and it has to be well nuanced as well, because memorialization does play its role. And I think that the Defiant Requiem Foundation and the events that you put on managed to steer a very careful path with regard to that. can I just mention, with regard to my own experience and the music from Terezin, two things. Firstly, when I was co-curating the Gideon Klein centenary commemorations in the Czech Republic in 2019 and the beginning of last year, I made a decision that we weren't going to perform any of his music in Terezin. We know, and the documentary evidence is there, that by the end of his incarceration there, he loathed everything about Terezin. He was deeply depressed. He was deeply unhappy. And I felt that, in a sense, it did his memory and his music a disservice to take it back into the ghetto. Now, of course, there is the other argument that, you know, we should take Gideon Klein's music and the music of the other Terezin composers back into the ghetto, you know, because thank God we've survived, and it's a way for us to bear witness. And I think that that is a discussion for another time. The other thing that I want to mention is this, that I think that too often, and I'm being quite honest here, but for too often, I think that we forget the connection between the Terezin composers and musicians and their Jewishness, that they are seen as Jews because they were persecuted, and many, if not most of them, ended up dead. But for some of them, they engaged very readily with their Judaism. And one of the things you will discover when hopefully you'll read my biography on Gideon Klein, which should be out in the new year. The English version, the Czech version is already out, is that I talk at length about Gideon Klein's Jewishness and the way that him and his family engaged with things Jewish, and the way that it finds its way into the music. You know, I talk about the string trio, for example, the way in which I feel that Klein almost comments in a midrashic, in a Talmudic way on the situation that he was there. So let's not forget that these Jewish composers were Jews. Some of them didn't, but some of them did engage very fully and very readily with their Jewishness, with Judaism.
Yeah, and I think of somebody like Victor Allman, who was not really, Victor Allman was raised Roman Catholic. His parents had converted after the First World War. And so this was not something he really engaged with until he got to Terezin, and then felt that it was his duty to engage with his Jewish history. So I think that's an important thing to think of as well, that, you know, in varying degrees, but that's always part of the background when you're looking at these composers.
I would also add that it's kind of, when we add this into, you know, anti-Semitism education and, you know, anti-Semitism as efforts to stamp out the Jewish people, you know, we're like chamomile. You do that, we just come back. That a lot of people have, you know, found occasion to re-engage with their sense of Jewishness when that sense of Jewishness is threatened. And I think that is also a very interesting aspect of Jewish religious and artistic culture that I think may be worth examining in the future as things go. I see that Alex has a hand up. Alex Klein.
Hi, thank you. Very, very interesting and very enthralling. You can use music for a negative way, or you can use it in a positive way. You can embrace it and show it off to the world the way it should be shown and should be played, or you can use it as an act of depression of what would be. So it's the way it's performed and where it's performed and how you publicize what you're doing that makes the difference between the way the world perceives the music. You can make it into negativity, or you can make it into a positive act. You know, we survived, yes. When your back's against the wall, you go to your roots, because I think David mentioned Jewishness and various other things. Everybody reverts back to their roots in times of troubles. Even if you're the most irreligious person, if your life is threatened or something else, you start to pray to God, or you start to embrace different things that you wouldn't normally do. But that is nature, that's human nature. So some of that music had changed with these composers pre-Terezin or Terezin, and you can see the change in the music in it during the time that they were there. So if you look at compositions pre-Terezin or pre the Holocaust, and you look at them afterwards, you can actually note the changes in the type of music. You know, the key is that they were paid in major or minor and so on and so forth, but without going into complications and going into motifs and notes and things. But it's apparent. So we have to look at these things in the context that they were written and why they were written, and then educate from there. So I think that's important. I'd like to know your opinion on that. It's important. Karen.
No, and yes, and I thank you for that, and I think that does go into some of the things Rachel and I were talking about, you know, in this idea of, can you divorce from the context or can you not? And I very firmly am in the camp of you cannot. You need to have that context in there. You need to have that full picture in there, and you need to and I will say, maybe sometimes that's not the easier road to go down, because, you know, there are nuances and there are complications, and there's a mix of light and dark mixed into, you know, all of that. But you have to present it all to give a complete picture. And I very firmly believe that that's an incredibly important thing to do, because if you leave something out, you're going to only be presenting half of what the picture is. And I don't think that serves anybody in the long run.
But how do we get this out, this type of music out to the wider audiences, and get the orchestras and quartets to actually play these at concerts as part of a concert, as opposed to playing it as part of a show thing or something else?
Right.
The music for the sake of the music, because the composition is good and good enough to be played at a concert with any philharmonic or symphony or quartet, and do the same. So why not get it out there? If Boozy and Hawks could publish it, it's good enough for everybody else.
It is, you know, it is. And I think part of that is, and I am, to be fair, I am not an expert on the inner workings of how, you know, large city orchestras work on a business model. That is not one of my areas of expertise. You know, but I do think in a lot of ways, things come down to exposure. So the more that we can get people to perform things, and the more that in whatever context we can, the more that things are out there, the more that names are known, the more that, you know, we get people playing these, you know, the more we get college, you know, students or professionals playing these in concerts and recitals, the more that something gets out there, the more that people will know it, and the more that people will not find it unusual to see these names on a concert program. And so I think it's important to add these things in and expose where you can. That's why I use a lot of this music when I'm teaching. I've brought a lot of this music to the attention of colleagues of mine at the universities I've taught at, and they've then incorporated it into concerts and recitals that they've done. And I think that's just how it starts, is putting as much exposure on it as you can.
But there's people like Joshua Bell who embrace these sorts of things, and because of the story of the violin, and because of the various other stories that he tells, you know, how he lost his violin and got it back, and so on and so forth. He's embracing, and certain people in their lives embrace their Jewishness at certain times. So maybe we should take advantage of the fact at the right time and do something. You've got more chance in America than we have in the UK. So please try your best.
Well,
Thank you so much.
I would also jump in here to add that I think that most large symphony orchestras are fundamentally fairly conservative institutions. The great cry always goes up, why is it always old people in the audience? Classical music is going to die, but there's always a fresh supply of old people in the audience. And because,
but we've also got our own Israeli symphony orchestra that should also embrace these things and seem to run away from Jewishness.
But the thing is that, and as any orchestra, and the Israeli orchestra is no different in this, they're fundamentally conservative institutions, and they're not going to be playing, music that isn't already a bit known, because that's not what the major donors who fund the orchestras really want to hear. So I think that one of the advantages that a route like the Defiant Requiem Foundation, or the way that Karen uses music from the Terezin composers in education, is to familiarize people when they're young with this music as music, and to say this is part of music history. Just because these composers died in a horrible way doesn't mean that they're not part of music history. And if more students grow up hearing Victor Allman, hearing Pavel Haas and Gideon Klein, that this doesn't become this becomes more familiar. It sort of can emerge out the back door of the ghetto, and may ultimately make it onto concert programs, just because people have heard it before. And it's not like, well, we could program Beethoven's Fifth because that's going to get butts in seats. And who is this Gideon Klein fellow?
But Karen, Karen, I admire you so much for the work you do, and please God, that your students will take up the baton and continue in what you're doing. But from the bottom of my heart, thank you for this wonderful evening and the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Carry on, please.
And I would just say, I would encourage everyone, for students or for colleagues you have that perform, or, whatever connections you have in whatever way you can, that's how you do it. And I don't think that's asking anybody to do anything unreasonable, but it's taking the circles and the resources that you have and bringing this music into what you already do. And that was sort of the decision that I made. So even with my students, when I teach the Verdi Requiem, I teach, the original when Verdi wrote it, but then I also teach the Verdi Requiem in Terezin. When I do Chopin, I show clips of the pianist. When I teach, different genres of instrumental music, I will put the Terezin composers in. It's little things that are easy to do that can have a massive impact. And I think we all need to recognize that we can do little things that add up to a lot.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
So I hang on. I see that Ellie Schleifer's had his hand up for a while.
Yes.
So we'll have Ellie, and then I see Marcia Dubrow. So we'll have Ellie and then Marcia.
Yes.
That's okay.
First of all, I want to second Alex Klein's praise for your work. Thank you very much. I think that's really important work, and I was not aware of it. So thanks for bringing it to our attention. It's very, very important. I have a few questions. Number one, in what way do you relate or incorporate David Bloch's heritage, what he has done? That's number one. Number two, how about, you were talking about composers, but what about the performers like Alice Hertz or Edith Krauss and many others?
Yes. So as far as David Bloch goes, I had the pleasure of meeting David Bloch when I was a graduate student here at Catholic University when I first started out. And I had been in touch with David for a few years before that. I had been introduced to him while I was working on my master's thesis. And he was incredibly kind and incredibly good to a young scholar just starting out. And so there's a lot of his work that I've incorporated into my own. There's a lot of things that he's done, and I've read so much of what he's written, and a lot of that provided my foundational material for learning about these performers in Terezin, and he actually came over to the United States, and I think it was 2007, 2008. He was going to New Jersey to look up some archival material from the family of Martin Roman, who was one of the jazz musicians in Terezin, and he made a stop in Washington, D.C., and so I got to hang out with him for a couple hours before he headed back to Israel. And I think he's just one of those sort of foundational pillar people when you're looking at music from Terezin. You have to know what he's done. And, you know, he's given me so many of the leads that I've been able to go off of. As far as the performers go, you know, I think my own research has not excluded performers. There's a lot of work I've done, you know, researching people who performed music, you know, and I think they're just as important. And so many of those, several of those performers had very good careers after the war too. And so we have recordings of them singing or playing, and, you know, they were part of what made the musical culture in Terezin what it was. You know, you can write music all you want, but if you have nobody who can play it or perform it, it's just a piece of paper. And so, you know, I think those names are important as well. You know, like you said, Alice and Edith Steiner-Krauss, David Grunfeld, David Guerin, who was the tenor soloist for the Verdi Requiem performances in Terezin. He actually went on 10 years later to be the tenor soloist in a Verdi Requiem performance with the Amsterdam Symphony Orchestra. And I have a recording of that. So I have him singing in Jamisco solo. And I think it was from like 1955. And so, you know, I think everything that I've said concerning the composers also can be applied to the performers as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marcia, you had a question.
Yeah, I kind of want to just get a take on everyone's thoughts about this, because it's an area that has not been mentioned. First of all, before I bring that up, though, I want to thank you, Karen, very much for your extremely in-depth and very broad conversation with Rachel. The two of you just really did a fabulous job. So thank you both for that. No one has mentioned the fact that the music of that period, the art music of that period, is a music in the grand context of the sweep of music history, is not the most accessible music.
Yes.
And I think that that's a significant factor in the challenge of bringing that music to a broader audience. Those of us who are schooled and trained in the history of music as musicologists, yes, we all know that, you know, this was done in a period of atonality and 12-tone systems and all kinds of pushing the envelope on tonality. But in my experience, when I have gone to a local concert, say, in even a synagogue context, for a commemoration of the Shoah, there is this thought that, oh, we're going to bring this music to the people, and in this case, the Jewish people, and they're going to respond very favorably to it. And I think it's just really so difficult. And I'm wondering, Karen, if in part the selection of the Verdi Requiem in and of itself, because of its accessibility to the general public's ear, was a way in, and if that was part of the original strategy, because I think it's so challenging, and it really asks the question in a much broader way of how do we expand a broad general audience's understanding of the context of the music. I know at Tanglewood every summer, the Boston Symphony does have a weekend that is devoted to new music. And so That's
Yes.
one approach, but it's not
yeah.
very well attended.
Yeah. Well, I think this is fair. So many of the composers who ended up in Terezin, you know, and Victor Allman is sort of the classic example of this. They were very much products of this second Viennese school, you know, period where, you know, I mean, how many people have you met that say that Schoenberg's 12-tone pieces are their favorite compositions in their life? Intellectually, I do understand that. But I think what you find when you listen to and I say Terezin composers as a collective, while understanding there were some differences stylistically between what they did. But, you know, for example, Victor Allman was not an atonal composer. He studied with both the Schoenberg and Berg, and he preferred actually going this idea of kind of stretching tonality to its limits without officially crossing that line. So I think a lot of these compositions, while there definitely is aspects of this sort of larger idea of what tonality means, you know, from this 20th century, early 20th century conversations, you know, these are not 12-tone compositions that these composers wrote. These are not completely atonal compositions that these composers wrote. So I think that does make it slightly easier because, you know, we're not asking, you know, an audience to sit through Pierrot Lunaire or something like that. But I do think, you know, to understand these composers, though, you do have to understand the musical education that they have and what they were being brought up in, which was this very sort of modernist musical world. You know, I think even the James Simone piece that I played, nobody would call that an atonal piece. Highly chromatic, sure. Atonal, not quite. But I think it also goes back to what Rachel said. You know, I think my students, and even I, when I first heard a lot of these pieces, you know, I was very much like a romanticism early 19th century girl when I came into my graduate work. I loved Chopin and Impressionism. I loved Debussy. I loved that pretty sweeping, highly emotional style music. But I think what I've learned is that if you expose students to this music, even if they don't think the music is pretty, they get intellectually intrigued by what the connotations of this music is, or how is a composer doing what they're doing. And I think if you expose an audience and start them young and explain the context around why composers were making these choices that they were, it's going to make it easier as an audience grows up to accept this music into their lives and into their world.
And I'd also add to that the fact that atonal music and, you know, the sort of mid 20th century modernism isn't necessarily pretty, that has never stopped any symphony orchestra from programming Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who,
yes,
to be perfectly honest, writes pieces of music that sound like someone strangling a cat. I think that there are ways to present mid 20th century modern music, and I don't think it's ever going to have the broad popular appeal of Beethoven, but there are ways to present it. And I think that there are then ways in presenting it to incorporate music by what we're calling the collective, the Terezin composers.
Yeah.
But I think that the point is that if you can present Stockhausen, you can present Pavel Haas.
Okay, thank you.
I see that Malcolm Miller has a question. Malcolm.
Oh, yeah, well, just following that, I would just like to add, I mean, that the very fact that they are writing music in what Marsha characterized as a sort of 20th century style is something which one is very much part of the importance of their music and their context. To evaluate them as musicians, as composers, and not as some sort of special case. I mean, you have to sort of see to what extent they were open to all the influences of the time and how they used them. And some will be more conservative and some will be more progressive. And obviously audiences vary, and some audiences will enjoy that as the more modernist. I think the idea of sort of somehow watering it down or something, I don't quite go for that. I mean, I think it's important to actually celebrate their creativity, the achievement on that sort of stylistic level as well. We're discussing obviously the importance of context and the nuanced presentation of that aspect in the sort of educational stroke sort of performance area, but I think also understanding the music and studying it and evaluating it is really, really important. And also when I say it, the genre is, this is obviously a much bigger topic about contemporary music. How do you take a particular body of music and present it? I mean, the question of, let's say, contemporary Israeli music. We had this whole discussion about that before. It's also about music. See it as music. So you could actually rename this music, when is, music from Terezin music? And we want to evaluate it in the sort of broader context. Anyway, thank you very much for a wonderful and a really stimulating session. I'll be quiet now.
Yeah. No, and I think it's true, that the world of music has long sort of struggled with how to present contemporary or modernist music. But I think, I will say, for me, the more that I've listened and the more I've been exposed and the more I've understood the context, the more I appreciate it. I'm not going to be the type that's going to, put a Schoenberg 12-tone piece on in my car while I'm driving, but it's the kind of thing that I can appreciate it for, even if it doesn't sound necessarily pretty to me. I can appreciate it knowing what the context and the larger picture is. And I think I feel that way even with some of the more highly chromatic compositions for some of our Terezin composers, that understanding who they studied with and the musical world that they were sort of raised in, I appreciate intellectually what the greater picture is.
All right. Are there any other questions? Yes, Alex has one more question.
Just wanted to point out some of the survivors were actually able to make careers out of their music, and I put a couple in the chat: Carol Berman and
Carol
Ansel, and there's quite a few more, but we should embrace that and mention that. So it is important also to say that some of the people who went through the suffering were able to, they would never get over it, but were able to use their musicality and their ability to make careers out, after the Shoah and after the problem. So it's something I think that is not often mentioned, but should be embraced. And the names of these people should be known, that they went through this, they survived, and they went on to make good careers for themselves. So I think that's just as important as the negativity and the pogrom and the problems that people tend to think about. So if we can show the world the good things and the positives, then let's embrace that, please, because it's just as important.
And I think that really does tie in with the idea of focusing as much on how the Jews lived as how they died. That there were survivors, and that this is part of the background of what made of what made world art music after 1945. That this is in the background, and that they didn't kill us all. We're still there.
Right.
Geraldine.
Thank you for a really wonderful thing. And people were concerned when the Defiant Requiem first came out, thinking, what are they doing, highlighting this Requiem and making a huge fuss about it when really we need to do these other composers. And I always felt that this is a portal. It's a way of opening up people's minds. And it's wonderful to see that this has happened, and we've got somebody like you persevering and bringing this music out in the right way. You know, Alex, you say people had a musical life afterwards. I think you have to understand that for most people who went through the Holocaust, most musicians, their lives were incomparably and utterly changed. And whereas a composer who was doing well, like Franz Schrecker in Germany, where his operas were in 27 opera houses after being performed, you know, his music was just vanished. Music that was banned, it was eradicated. The scores were burnt, the plates on which they were made were eradicated. And to those who managed to go somewhere else, like Korngold, found a way of doing something in Hollywood, but he was never able to write operas and compose symphonies that he might have done at home. So that the disruption is unfathomable, and we have to realize that, and so that what we can do to rehabilitate the music that we can do, and you know, there have been lots and lots of people that are advocating for that and helping. And I put in the chat the suppressed music email list that we started in 1999. And it has many people from around the world who mention when Korngold symphonies are being performed or Schrecker's operas. And so it might be very nice for you to belong to that list, because then you can say what you're doing, and also—
I actually am on that list. I am on that list. So, but I will start sending emails as we have events and things, so that people know what's going on. You know, but I think, you know, and Geraldine, you were very kind in your wording. I do know, you know, there have been, over the years, there has been a little bit of, when Defiant Requiem was getting off the ground and becoming a little bit more known in the public. And I was, you know, this was right in the middle of my graduate school days at Catholic University, and Murray Sidlin was one of my dissertation advisors. And so I was there and sort of have seen the controversy a little bit up front and personal. And I think whenever somebody comes along and is trying to present something in a new way, there's always going to be a little bit of a pushback. But what I hoped a little bit of this conversation showed was a little bit of sort of how we go about choosing to do the things and the performances and the research that we do. And I think, you know, for me personally, this idea of how is a story presented, or what way can we present music and a narrative that's going to stick with people when they leave a concert hall, that to me, you know, even if it may seem a little bit dramatic to other people, I think those are the things that stick with me. You know, this idea of seeing video and hearing music and hearing words and seeing, you know, the memories of a survivor on film is going to stick with me more than, you know, than other things. You know, I'm going to walk out of there going, I just experienced something that I will remember for a very long time afterwards. And so I don't think it's, you know, I think I want people to understand too, when I say, you know, concert dramas, I think people tend to focus on that word drama, and I'm using that word because I don't really know what other way to describe, but it's not this idea of making something overly dramatic or making, you know, trying to create extra drama, but it's this idea of giving a musical experience and knowledge to people that they're going to remember it when they walk out. And so, you know, I think if anything, that's always what Defiant Requiem has tried to do.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, as I said, I always saw it as a wonderful opening for people who may not come in to hear a recital of Gideon Klein. You know, it's really we have to find people in all different ways, not just,
Yes.
you know, the way, the worthy ways we think. We lots of ways
Right.
are worthy. So thank you so
Right.
much.
And I think that's an
Geraldine, I think you got me wrong, because it's not that I'm trying to, I know what people went through because my family went through the same thing, and I know many people who from the Holocaust survivors, from the second generation and third generation, that were lived through the trauma of that, which you can never get away from. But my thinking is, from something that is bad, we have to try and make something good, so it should never happen again. But that's my ultimate aim with everything. So, you know, when we had Magnified and Sanctified, and we have the various other things that we were doing at various different universities, it's to embrace this and to understand this from people around the world. So people should know, and it's not just the academia side of things, it should be the public side of things as well. They should be educated in a way that they can understand and respect without having to know to read music or to know the notes or anything else, just to embrace what we have, which is as good as anybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think sort of, you know, going off, Alex, what you just said, and also Geraldine, what you mentioned, I think this gets back to this idea, you know, and I think what I found a little bit when people have pushed back a little bit on what Defiant Requiem has done, I think it goes back to this idea of sort of this tunnel, you know, this tunnel vision for those of us who have studied or in maybe a little bit more academic circles of this work, that we get in our heads this idea that things should be done a certain way, or there's like one way that this needs to be presented to the world. And I think we have to realize that, you know, what makes us human and what makes us a human population is that we are diverse, and that there are so many different ways that we can teach people and that we can educate people and bring things to people's attention. And so, you know, I think it's a little bit, you know, that taking the blinders off and realizing there's a great, big, wide, creative world out there, and we have all of these tools at our disposal to educate people about this thing that is so important that people should know. And I think, you know, what I love is seeing people who come to Defiant Requiem who maybe have never been to a symphony orchestra concert or a choral concert, or have never been to something classical music concert-esque, and they get to hear this monument of classical music history within this amazing narrative, and that they can walk away and maybe say, I'm going to look up a little bit more about this, or the next time that they see a symphony concert come their way in their location, oh, that's maybe something I would like to go see. So I think getting creative is not a bad thing here. It's not creating information, but it's engaging people in ways that they will remember, and that they will then maybe branch out in their own cultural lives to learn more.
Geraldine, what was the reaction that from Canterbury when this was when you had the performance in the cathedral, and then so what was the non-Jewish audience reactions? You had this in the B'nai B'rith Music Festival, or do you remember how it went? And because that's an important thing that we can learn from, because you firsthand got a reaction, and that maybe Malcolm Miller might know if he was there, but or Alex Knapp, I don't know, but people who actually lived through it or went there would have a better idea, because that's the important thing. How was it perceived, and how was it greeted by the audience?
Alex, what I can say, I can't remember an instant reaction, but you know, 1986 was a very early time of a concert of music from Terezin. you know, the National Ensemble and other groups have been doing it, you know, in the 2000s. We were quite pioneers, and everything just has a step-by-step, you know, I can't tell. We had a full cathedral having, you know, good publicity for a Hebrew oratorio in a Christian cathedral. We had a film made of Edith Krauss and Coral Berman. It was called They Never Touched My Bread. I don't know if you can find it anywhere. It was made by ITV, the independent television, and broadcast on the 9th of November, 1986, saying this is Remembrance Sunday and the Jews have more to remember than others. And it started with railway lines and Edith Krauss on a train, this time to Canterbury rather than to Terezin. And so, you know, slowly things ramify, and, you know, we set up the International Forum for Suppressed Music in 1999. And that's when we made that list and brought together all the people who were working in this. We've had 2 international conferences. The first one was on the pupils of Franz Schrecker, who were all the creme de la creme of European composers studying in Berlin Hochschule with the most renowned teacher. And many of them were Jews, and their music has been suppressed. You know, we did one on the impact of Nazism on the development of 20th century music. So, you know, we've brought together the key players and trying to promote what they're doing with academic conferences, concerts, things like that. And slowly things are developing. And, you know, Karen and the Defiant Requiem is part of the picture. And I think it's a very valuable part of the picture.
So on that note, let me say a big thank you to our presenter, Karen Uslin. Thank you so much for presenting. And Rachel, really big thanks to you for doing a wonderful job as interrogator / interviewer. Really, thank you both very, very much. And we look forward to everyone joining us next week. We'll be joined by Jeremiah Lockwood, who's talking about a project that he's doing with us in LA. Excuse me, that's called Conversations, which is his weekly blog on Jewish music, his various activities in Brooklyn and his research, and a great opportunity for all of us. So again, a big thank you to Karen and also to Rachel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Karen, thanks for coming on with me. This was great.
This was amazing. Thank you for having me.